Time now for the Live on Live interview. Now, a big NATO summit is being held tomorrow in the Polish capital, Warsaw. It's expected to endorse its biggest military build-up since the Cold War. They're set to deploy 4 multinational battalions to the Baltic nations and Poland. So is this the beginning of another Cold War? Because following Russia's annexation of Crimea from Ukraine in 2014, NATO is worried that Russia could get its hands on an area of land called the Suwalki Gap, that's situated between Russia's highly militarized Kaliningrad area and Belarus. Now, to get a handle on what's going on and how the Russians see all of this, I'm joined by Russia expert Oleg Kobtzeff from the American University in Paris. Thanks for coming in, Oleg.
Thank you.
First question perhaps. How likely is it that Russia would invade and try and take over this area? How important is it to them?
Important, maybe not. I think that it's rather a pawn in a much greater game, but it's the risk is very high indeed, and it could happen because simply it has already happened with Crimea.
Right.
So, yes, there is a clear and present danger. If I may comment on what you said about the possible beginning of a Cold War.
I know that's very dramatic, isn't it? But it does seem as if the tensions are very heightened.
And I think it is much worse that could happen than a Cold War. Here's the difference with the Cold War. In the Cold War, the two sides after 1945 did not really take, or after, let's say, 1948, 49, after all the Soviet Union had entirely invaded all of its neighbors, no side really took any territories from each other, in Europe at least. What's happening here, we're not in a regular Cold War routine. We are more in a much more unstable and dangerous game, like between 1945, 1948, 49, which was actually the most dangerous period in the Cold War. The other difference is public opinion. Public opinion would always step in to try to reduce the tensions because of the fear. And you had also diplomats who had just gone through 2 world wars and who were afraid and would stop when the escalation went too fast. We don't have that anymore. We do not have the old Cold War diplomats like Chou En-lai, like Gromyko, like Kissinger. Now what we have is people who never experienced what that generation experienced. And the same can be said about the world public opinions, who are cheering their sides a little bit like at a football game. And that is actually the great difference with the Cold War, and what I think is much, much more dangerous. Because also we have the feeling that the Cold War is behind us, it's old history, something that terrible will never happen again, because we live in a world that is actually so peaceful and so stable, and the real bad guys are in fact in the Middle East.
Let's look a bit more closely at what's take the temperature of what's happening in Russia in particular, because we hear so much more from, as it were, the NATO members' side. Now, NATO has been playing war games in Eastern Europe of late, the so-called Anaconda maneuvers in Poland. They've been focused partly on this area called the Gap. They've deeply annoyed the Russian President Vladimir Putin. He's accused NATO, just last week, he accused NATO of triggering a new arms race. So he's really using some very strong language. Tell us why Vladimir Putin is so outraged over the NATO stance.
All right, first about NATO. It's perfectly normal for NATO to be playing war games, because if a country like Russia just simply takes away through a coup d'etat territory the size of Crimea, especially with the strategic value of Crimea, it's perfectly normal for NATO to be scared, especially the countries that were part of the Soviet Union, like the 3 Baltic states, or the countries of the former Warsaw Pact, like Poland. They are scared. It's normal. and NATO has to satisfy their security, their security needs, or at least their perceptions of insecurity. Now, why would Putin be outraged? It's not just Putin. Here we have to understand that it's everybody, that it's the majority of Russians, including...
He has huge backing then, does he?
Yes.
Is he the voice of Russia?
Unfortunately, yes. Take somebody like Gorbachev. Let's look at what happened. Let's backtrack. Let's go to the very beginning of the story. Eastern Germany becomes part of NATO. That was an agreement. That was the deal from the beginning. According to Gorbachev, and I don't see why Gorbachev would have lied about this, NATO, or the NATO partners, especially President George H. Bush, promised that there would not be NATO would not go a foot further east than Eastern Germany. What have we seen? First of all, we see Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary become part of NATO. Did Russia react violently? They didn't like it, but there was nothing violent about it. Then, a little bit later, you see 7 more countries joining NATO, including 3 former republics of the Soviet Union. Republics, by the way, which, yes, they were invaded after 20 years of independence, but that have been part of the Russian Empire for centuries. Did Russia react violently? Russia protested, but there was nothing violent about that. Finally, we get to 2008, where Ukraine and Georgia are literally invited to join NATO. Now here, there's a huge difference, because Kiev was the first capital of what would become the Ukraine, Belarus, but also of Russia. Moscow was a little town that was under the jurisdiction of Kiev. Novgorod in the far north, in the Baltic, not far from where is St. Petersburg, was under the jurisdiction of the great prince in Kiev. Kiev was the capital of the Russians' own country. They historically, they can claim that as well. Now, of course, there were huge differences. Ukraine became very different. Russians haven't been taking that into account and oppressing Ukrainians. That's correct. But when you really invite something that had been so intimately linked to Russian history for centuries and centuries, especially when you had the Russian capital there in medieval times, and lots of common history. The writer Gogol, the wars, all of the wars fought together against the Turks, against the Germans in World War I, the Germans in World War II, etc., etc. That is a tremendous trauma in a country that is still trying to find its identity after the communist Soviet internationalist identity has been taken away from them. Yeah. So here, it's Putin is only the expression of something much greater than his own personal dictatorial ambitions, and that's the danger. Yeah. Gorbachev is now basically supporting Putin, at least whereas Gorbachev was one of his major opponents. But he has to support him now because, indeed, he says himself, he's been repeating this to many, he feels that he got a very bad deal, in fact. And also, you have to respond to the Russian people who feel, how do you sell a liberal foreign affairs policy after you have seen that NATO just keeps advancing its borders closer and closer to Russia? It's natural for the Russians to ask, okay, what's next? Are they going to demand the independence of Siberia, the independence of Karelia? And you will find lots of historical, cultural arguments to say, yes, these countries should be independent. They were oppressed by Russia. Again, the question is, how far is this going to go?
Yeah, indeed. Well, I mean, I don't know. Can you give us an idea about that? I mean, just today, German Chancellor Angela Merkel has said that Russia's actions in Ukraine back in 2014 have led to a loss of trust with the West. You know, she's a pretty moderate, in the way she speaks. She's very diplomatic. So it does sound as if she's also already giving a sort of warning shot, in a way, to Russia. Do you think that relations are now permanently, as it were, damaged since the annexation of Crimea?
Definitely. Luckily, we do have Angela Merkel, by the way. She is a she is a tremendous force of balancing between East and West. Let's remember, she speaks Russian fluently. Putin speaks German fluently.
Interesting.
That helps a lot. And she understands the mentalities of people who were living under communism, since she was one of them.
So what do you think she will be pushing for at the NATO meeting tomorrow?
I would say I hope that she will be a balancing force, unless it's too late already. And then she's right. Yes, she might recognize privately that things went too far with NATO, but now, indeed, yes, Russia has lost trust with the West, because Russia itself overreacted and went certainly much too far in trying to stop this advance of NATO by indeed annexing a huge territory, very strategic, and that could lead to extreme danger.
Thank you very much for all those enlightening points. Russia specialist Oleg Kobtzeff. That's all we have time for today. From everyone here at Paris Live PM, do hope you'll join us again tomorrow. In the meantime, bye-bye.